From the Cronkite studios in downtown Phoenix, this is Cronkite News.
Good evening and welcome to this special edition of Cronkite News on Arizona PBS. I'm Sammy Giebers. Tonight we take a look back at the top stories from our Borderlands team. From migrants being left at bus stations to how the proposed border wall could impact endangered species.
For years, Immigration and Customs Enforcement in Phoenix has dropped off migrants at Greyhound stations after releasing them pending court hearings. The bus company recently asked they not be brought inside their facilities anymore. Instead, they are now being dropped off just a few feet outside, creating a whole new set of challenges. Cronkite News reporter Walter Panate takes a closer look at the legalities involved. Walter?
Dozens of volunteers have created a network responding to bus stations in Phoenix when immigrants are dropped off. Many of these families do not have money and have to wait on a relative or advocacy group to buy their ticket onto their next destination. This was the scene at one of Greyhound's bus stations in Phoenix, just moments after dozens of migrants were dropped off late last week.
Well, they're not allowed inside the Greyhound station, but we were at least at the parking lot on a sidewalk, at least against a wall where there was some shade. So now they forced us out to an intersection on a sidewalk.
On a sidewalk, even after Greyhound publicly has asked ICE not to continue its practice of dropping migrants at their locations after they've been processed for seeking asylum. Immigration attorney Ayensa Millan says ICE is able to skirt this request by dropping the migrants off on the sidewalk.
They're technically following the law. Could they do more to make sure that these people perhaps don't become victims of a crime if you're leaving them in the middle of the street? Absolutely.
Greyhound, the manager, Mr. Garcia, has said that he has spoken to ICE and begged them not to drop them off here.
Melissa Hubert is a church volunteer who helps these migrants right after they're left at these stations without money or travel arrangements made. Many of them don't speak English or Spanish, instead, indigenous languages. Volunteers are expressing their frustration with Greyhound's policy, but by law, they're not breaking any rules.
Technically, in any private property, if I don't want someone in my property, I have the legal right to refuse to allow them in my property.
In a statement, Greyhound said, if a person does not purchase a ticket or have reservations to travel that day, our standard policy does not allow them to remain in our stations as our facilities have limited capacity, end quote. However, in an email response to Cronkite News asking why the agency continues to drop off migrants at Greyhound stations, an ICE spokesperson referred us back to Greyhound, only adding, quote, we continue to work with faith-based organizations and NGOs, though when they cannot accommodate, as courtesy, we drop them off near public transportation so they can make final travel arrangements as they see fit. One of the challenges is finding a place for these migrants to sleep before sundown. If not, they'll be forced to sleep on the street.
But we need shelter. They need somewhere to sleep. So definitely City of Phoenix needs to talk to ICE, needs to figure out what's happening in their own backyard.
With the special counsel's investigation now over and the 2020 presidential election in full swing, President Donald Trump is shifting his focus back to one of his favorite topics, immigration.
Over the past several days, the president has cut off hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Central American nations where migrants are coming from and threatened to seal off the entire southern border if something doesn't change soon. The threats coming after Trump's decision to declare a national emergency to expand the border wall without approval from Congress.
We've got the very best team coverage headed your way from our bureau in Washington, D.C. to our crew on the ground in Texas.
But first, let's send it over to Walter Panate here in the Cronkite News Broadcast Center. He went to Senator Martha McSally's roundtable earlier this morning. Walter, what did she have to say about this border battle?
Yes, in addition to Senator McSally, the meeting also included state and federal officials and aid group representatives. While most of their conversation took place away from the cameras, McSally says her intention behind this kind of meeting is to look for ways to improve coordination between agencies when immigrants are released from federal custody here in Arizona.
This is not about blaming, or this is not about trying to point fingers at anybody, but we just got to come together and figure out how we can do a better job coordinating and communicating given the circumstances that I just gave.
Senator Martha McSally taking the lead this morning during a roundtable discussion in Phoenix talking about immigration. The Republican leader making it clear she feels the number of migrant families detained at the border has reached crisis levels and asked all hands to be on deck to manage it.
It's my view that we got to keep the legitimate trade and travel and cross-border commerce happening at the ports of entry, while we also need to secure our border and address this crisis.
Joining McSally today were Phoenix Icefield Office Director Enrique Lucero and Tim Romer with Governor Doug Ducey's office. Also in attendance were Southern Arizona federal law enforcement agencies and migrant humanitarian aid groups. Part of the conversation centered around President Trump's recent comments saying he is considering closing the southern border.
I don't want to speak for the president, but those of us in Arizona who have seen the challenges at the border and seen the challenges related to the numbers and how they're going up, because cartels are taking advantage of these loopholes we have. This is an emergency, and it has been a crisis, which is why we've been trying to fund border security, why we've been trying to close these loopholes, why we know we need more resources to CBP so that they can actually do their primary job.
According to McSally, 2,000 migrants are being detained at the southern border every day. Just in the last 3 months in Arizona, 18,500 have been released due to overflow challenges.
The conversation will to be continued. I think it's just important in our role as a convener to bring people together to see if we can find some better understanding of what's in the art of the possible to address issues like this.
McSally headed to D.C. after today's meeting, saying she will continue to push for additional border security measures. She also highlighted that as of this fiscal year, 268,000 migrants, primarily families, have been apprehended nationwide. In the broadcast center, Walter Penate, Cronkite News.
Right now, the ACLU is demanding an investigation into, quote, abusive and inhumane conditions at an El Paso Border Patrol detention center. The group says border agents deprived hundreds of families of sleep, forced children to sleep on trash-strewn gravel, and forced families to stand for prolonged periods of time. So we sent a crew there to see what's actually going on for ourselves. Austin Westfall joins us now from Texas with the details. Austin?
The migrants were cleared from the overpass as of late last night. CBP moved them to a nearby area following public outcry. Now here in El Paso, ICE is still dropping migrants off at nearby bus stations and at churches just like this one. I've been here at Caminos de Vida all day. The church houses and feeds the migrants. We joined the church's associate pastor as he drove 14 migrants to the airport and bus station earlier today.
We believe in the love of Christ. We believe that God loves them. They're his children. We're brothers and sisters in Christ. And even if they don't believe the same we do, at the same time, they're also human beings. And we can't just throw humans and treat them this way and throw them in the street. That's just not the proper thing to do.
The overpass was cleared as of late last night. CBP moved those migrants to a nearby area following public outcry. Now here in El Paso, ICE is still dropping off migrants at bus stations. Cabrera says the migrants have travel tickets courtesy of sponsors in other cities. He says about 90 migrants were dropped off here at this church late last week, and more are expected this week. In El Paso, Austin Westfall, Cronkite News.
President Donald Trump recently threatened to shut down some ports of entry on the southern border this week if Mexico didn't stop all illegal immigration into the U.S. He says we have, quote, run out of space, unquote. Cronkite News reporter Micah Bledsoe is live from Washington, D.C. with more. Micah?
President Donald Trump's solution to the latest surge at the border? Shut it down. Critics say that would keep workers and tourists from coming to the U.S., disrupt billions of dollars in trade with Mexico, and do little to stem the flow of migrants. Supporters acknowledge the drawbacks, but say it may be the only way to send a message to Mexico. President Trump blamed Congress and the Mexican government for not doing enough to stop the rise in migrants showing up at the southern border. So he took matters into his own hands.
Mexico's tough. They can stop them. And if they don't stop them, we're closing the border. They'll close it, and we'll keep it closed for a long time. I'm not playing games.
That was Trump's Saturday following tweets Friday threatening to shut the border. But while the president insists he is not playing games, skeptics wonder if he's willing to cut off all trade and travel with the third largest trading partner of the U.S.
Arizona is heavily dependent on U.S.-Mexico trade. You're talking about $500 billion in trade entering through these land ports of entry, primarily in Texas, but Arizona is also significantly affected.
Fair Media Director Ira Melman says there's every reason to believe Trump will close the border unless Congress or the Mexican government give the president more to work with.
If they're not going to give the president other options for dealing with this, then they have, only themselves to blame.
Melman agrees that closing the border isn't a good option, but it's the only one left for the U.S. to regain control over the border.
It is certainly in the interest of the American people to have a border that is, under some kind of reasonable control, which it is not now.
But the Cato Institute's David Beer says closing the border wouldn't be in the best interest of nearly 5 million American jobs that are dependent on trade from Mexico.
Shutting down legal access to the United States is a measure that's not related to the problem at hand at all.
The proposal is also drawing strong opposition from business. The Arizona Chamber of Commerce said over the weekend that closing the border would be an economic catastrophe. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce said today that it shares administration concerns over the surge of migrants, but that closing the border would be the wrong solution. In Washington, Micah Bledsoe, Cronkite News.
Governor Doug Ducey met with Mexican Ambassador to the United States, Martha Bárcena, discussing efforts to strengthen Arizona-Mexico economic ties.
Austin Westfall joins us live with more on what the governor was able to accomplish. Austin?
Yeah, this was Bárcena's first official visit to Arizona as U.S. ambassador. Both Governor Ducey and Ambassador Bárcena specifically focused today's public meeting on the importance of maintaining and growing trade relations between Arizona and Mexico. They also highlighted the cultural and geographic ties that have united the two territories for decades.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Governor Ducey and Ambassador Bárcena made their first joint public appearance at the Canby Hotel in Phoenix. The governor has been pushing in Congress for the ratification of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, known as the USMCA. This agreement is President Trump's replacement for the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Today, Ducey highlighted the importance of pushing this treaty through in order to continue building a strong financial partnership with Mexico.
In 2018, Arizona's total trade with Mexico and Canada exceeded $20 billion, but there's a lot more room to grow.
The contributions of the Mexican community to the economy, the society, and the culture of the U.S. are undeniable. The U.S. of today cannot be explained without the Mexican presence.
Today's meeting happened under the umbrella of the 60th anniversary of the Arizona-Mexico Commission, a nonprofit cross-border organization pushing for economic prosperity and growth between Arizona and Mexico. Ambassador Bárcena will also visit Tucson to meet with community and state officials there, focusing on border and immigration issues. In the broadcast center, Austin Westfall, Cronkite News.
We've been reporting over the past few weeks on the surge of migrant families seeking asylum at the southern border. With the increase in numbers, humanitarian aid groups have stepped up, offering these families the basic services they need as they transition toward their final destinations in the U.S. Here in Arizona, one location in particular has opened its doors to them, becoming a unique shelter in the desert. Marcela Baeto went to Tucson, and she's joining us live from the Cronkite First Amendment Forum to tell us more about it. Marcela?
Casa Alitas has been providing care to migrant mothers and children for years now. But with this influx of migrants crossing into the United States, primarily being families, they decided to convert this iconic monastery into a temporary home for thousands of migrants.
These are raw human beings with emotions and hearts and brains that are coming here.
Those people Carrasco Ortiz is talking about are the hundreds of migrants Casa Alitas is currently housing at the old Benedictine monastery in Tucson. Once a holy place, now turned into a shelter for about 210 migrants made up of mothers, fathers, and children, all seeking asylum from their home countries.
For migrants who arrive here at Casa Elitas every single day, they're expected to stay here for 1 to 3 days until their travel arrangements are planned. Those travel plans are coordinated by the help of volunteers like Victoria Ortiz.
The first thing is to call a family member. Then we wait until that family member has bought either a bus ticket or a plane ticket for them.
After that, migrants are put through a medical screening. They receive food and are able to get a clean set of clothes before they begin traveling to reunite with family members already in the U.S. and await their first immigration court date. The monastery was built in 1935, welcoming a group of pioneer nuns who migrated from Switzerland. It closed in February 2018 after being purchased by a developer who has allowed Catholic Charities to use it as this temporary migrant shelter. The charity will be able to stay until August of this year. That's when the developer will begin the construction of new condos on the site.
It's the monastery one?
But for now, Rodriguez says she hopes people realize that what these migrants are doing by coming to the United States is not illegal.
They're not undocumented. These are folks that are in process. So I think one of the most frustrating comments I hear is people say, why can't they just do it the right way? And this is literally the right way. Like, you present and you are making your request for asylum or refuge, and you're given a court date.
While they wait for that court date, this monastery is for many of these families the first place they've felt safe in a long time.
When you're sitting with someone in front of you who is afraid and fleeing and clearly just wants a safe place to land with their kid, I don't think there's any other thing to do but to help them.
Casa Elitas has until August until they're going to have to relocate, but they said they're looking into options. Live in the First Amendment Forum, Marcela Baedo, Cronkite News.
According to officials, El Paso, Texas is seeing a large, seemingly unmanageable influx of migrants. U.S. Customs and Border Protection says they've seen just over a 1,600% increase in the number of families apprehended within this fiscal year at the city's port of entry.
Local bus stations and churches have become transitional locations for many of them throughout several southern U.S. cities. Reporter Austin Westfall was in El Paso and got a first-hand look at the situation. Austin?
Yeah, El Paso has become a significant example of why U.S. officials say the country's immigration system is at its breaking point.
Now we have to rush to the bus stop.
Israel Cabrera is the associate pastor of Caminos de Vida, a church in El Paso taking in migrants after Immigration and Customs Enforcement drops them off.
Dina Lopez.
He's spending part of his day shuttling 14 people to the local airport and Greyhound bus station.
They were overwhelmed with joy. Someone said, this happiness that we feel is priceless.
It wasn't easy. We were very cold and always hungry. The food isn't good and it was very limited. Thank God that we are here.
Cabrera said the 14 people were part of a group of about 90 that ICE dropped off at his church a few nights before. All the migrants were once held in the same area seen in these photos. Dozens of them, including children, were housed behind a razor-wired fence under a bridge near Customs and Border Protection. The image is going viral and inciting public outcry.
Many of them said, tonight we no longer sleep on the rocks, we no longer sleep in dirt, we have a bed.
This has scarred our lives, our minds, and at times we suffer for our kids, for something better for them. And I come from Honduras, and the situation of my country is not good, and that's why we looked for something better.
But officials say the large number of people looking for something better is causing a crisis at the southern border.
And nowhere has that crisis manifested more acutely than here in El Paso.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Kevin K. McAleenan saying at a press conference last month that almost 3,500 migrants were in custody in the city that morning. Their facilities are designed to hold much less than that.
We had over 1,000 apprehensions in this one sector alone on Monday and encounters at our port of entry. The vast majority, again, families from Central America.
Many families like Castillo's are now en route to other U.S. cities courtesy of a sponsor. But not every migrant family has a ticket out of El Paso. This group of migrants was dropped off at the Greyhound bus station around 8:30 one night. Greyhound employees would not allow anyone to stay inside if they did not have a bus ticket.
It's 56 degrees out here. Children are cold, and volunteers like this are showing up and they're helping out any way they can.
That volunteer giving a hug is Doris Reamer.
I brought some bags that have like tarps and socks and a little bit of food.
She isn't affiliated with any activist group, church, or government agency, She says she simply came to help those in need.
I went back in and asked if they could please go back in because it's so cold. For the kids, it's cold.
Reamer was hoping church volunteers would eventually come and provide the families with a place to sleep at night, but that hadn't happened by the time our team left the area.
Why do you do what you do?
Because we're all brothers and sisters. We're children of God. For love.
This administration wants to undermine due process for migrants as much as they can.
Robert Hyman is the policy director for Border Network for Human Rights, an El Paso group that advocates for immigration policy change. He says BNHR is working with local lawmakers on policies to increase personnel at ports of entry and promote transparency among agencies like ICE and Customs and Border Protection.
If we're able to restore the asylum system to the way that it should be working, that it was designed to work, and we're able to make CBP and ICE and this administration put a greater prominence on treating people humanely, then we'll have made real progress.
The only way to fundamentally address these flows is for Congress to act and to reinstate integrity into our immigration system.
Now, by March 2018, CBP's El Paso sector had apprehended about 3,000 migrant families. By the same time this year, that number is already over 53,000. Since that press conference with McAleenan, President Trump has named him the acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, replacing Kirstjen Nielsen, who left the position Sunday. In the studio, Austin Westfall, Cronkite News.
You racist, sexist bigot. That's the attention-grabbing title of a documentary recently screened at Civic Space Park in downtown Phoenix. The film tells the story of several Arizonans as they share details of how they've been discriminated against. Cronkite News reporter Austin Westfall was there and caught the public's reaction to the film.
Oh, you're Jewish? I'll pray for you.
Where are your feathers?
I didn't raise you to look like this. I didn't raise you to be like this.
Testimonials like these hit home for Unique Yazzie.
He lives in a world where he doesn't understand racism, and it's a privileged kind of upbringing that I'm trying to bring him into, but there are moments that I see it.
Yazzie is talking about her 11-year-old son, who she says has been called racist names in the past.
That's the world he has to grow up in. And that's sad.
That's why she came to Civic Space Park for a screening of You Racist, Sexist Bigot, a locally made documentary showcasing real-life stories of discrimination in Arizona.
What, next thing you know, your daughter's gonna bring one home, then what? Then you gotta burn the house down.
Can't you find somebody in your own race?
I'm a native-born Arizonan.
The film's co-director Matt Steinkamp says the idea for the film came after the 2016 presidential election.
There was a lot of media that was really putting out stories and characterizing people of color and people of different identities in a very negative way.
That's what Steinkamp says motivated him to want to give those people the space to tell their story.
The goal of the film is to start a conversation about discrimination in the time when people are trying to quiet those conversations.
I let so much slide before I finally said something, like I'm uncomfortable.
Fíjate qué es eso, ¿no? La gente nos tiene como monstruos.
Is that bag that you have, does it contain bombs?
I think it's very relevant. I think more people should see that, I think, and gets people out of their comfort zone, and that's important.
You're a tranny.
Once you go black, you never go back.
In Phoenix, Austin Westfall, Cronkite News.
The president's proposed 2020 federal budget includes heavy cuts to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Cronkite News reporter Hattie Meyer went to the border to speak with the conservationists about what those cuts might mean for the wildlife that lives in the Sonoran Desert.
The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service faces a $267 million cut under the president's budget proposal. The budget also includes billions of dollars to build a wall along the southern border. Environmentalists from the Center for Biological Diversity worry the potential agency cuts, coupled with increased funding for a wall, might devastate the wildlife that lives along the border.
The Sonoran Desert is the quiet home to many of Arizona's indigenous species. But that silence has given way to the sounds of barrier construction along the Arizona border.
It's beautiful, and you have that feeling that there's wildlife here. And then you see that border wall.
Conservationists like Saraglio say they're worried about the potential impact a new border wall would have on these already fragile lands. Their concern is growing as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, which manages most of these lands, falls under the umbrella of the Department of Interior. It's facing a potential cut which would bring it down from $14.5 billion to $12.5 billion.
It's not like a city. You put up a border wall here and it has all kinds of really serious and damaging impacts on wildlife.
According to a study done by the Center for Biological Diversity, these cuts would slash funding that would go into restoring endangered populations. Conservationists worry that money would instead go towards building the proposed new border wall.
If this wall were to be completed through that area, it would totally eliminate this wildlife corridor for jaguars.
Saraglio says barriers like barbed wire fences pose little threat to wildlife, but the steel bars that line parts of the U.S.-Mexico border are a different story.
As you can see, the gaps in this fence are barely big enough for me to fit my arm through, meaning animals such as Mexican wolves and jaguars, which migrate across the border, can't make it through.
According to Saraglio, many other mammals also rely on crossing the border for access to resources, territory, and mates.
It affects genetic diversity in populations. It affects animals' ability to get to water sources and food sources that they need, especially on a seasonal basis.
But Jim DeVos, assistant director for Arizona Game and Fish, says plans for the new border wall would take into account the wildlife that lives in these areas.
The president and his staff have said that the building of a border barrier doesn't indicate that it's a complete block to the entire border, and that there are ways that if they're identified as important wildlife corridors can be managed with intense electronic monitoring.
Until that happens, advocates like Saraglio say trying to preserve these lands is key in making sure the animals who call them home have a chance to survive.
I wish I could bring everybody in the United States, one at a time, up here to look at these rugged hills and look at this landscape and just feel it. I think if that were the case, then we wouldn't have a border wall.
President Donald Trump previously demanded $5.7 billion for a border wall, which Congress denied. His new budget requests $8.6 billion for the same wall. In the broadcast center, Hattie Meyer, Cronkite News.
That's it for this special edition of Cronkite News Tonight. Thanks for joining us. For top Arizona stories anytime, go to cronkitenews.azpbs.org.